Good evening, everyone. My name is Marta Elena, and I am a researcher from the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. This presentation, as mentioned briefly before, it will be on the heat-health nexus within the urban context, looking specifically at the social inequalities and the built environment characteristic with a specific focus on gender. Okay. Just to give you a brief overview of my activities, I'm working at the CMCC, that is a research center that works in different parts of Italy, as you can see in the map in the left side of the slide. Specifically, I'm working with the division of Caserta that is about regional models and geo-Hydrological impacts. And with this division, I developed my PhD research that I finished in June, that was about assessment of inequalities with the use of high-resolution climate data provided by division and vulnerability associated with the socioeconomic factors as well as built environment characteristics. And in the last year, since 2019, I am developing risk assessment analysis in order to understand which are the main determinants that can influence the vulnerability of a specific system. That can be tourism, or it can be also in urban areas, as well as its population and so on. For what it might concern the impact on agriculture, forest and ecosystem services division, this is located in Viterbo. And for this division, I am a consultant for the international negotiation on climate, supporting the Ministry of Ecological Transition for issues related to adaptation to climate change. Just to provide you a background of my research that will be the focus of this presentation, the plot that you can see in the left, probably most of you already see it. It's a plot about the shared socioeconomic pathways provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its latest report, assessment reports, the number 6. Each line corresponds to a quantity of specific emissions in the atmosphere. And in each case, each shared socioeconomic pathway corresponds to a certain level of impacts due to the increase of temperatures in the atmosphere. So for what it might concern the environment of the cities are an hotspot in relation to climate change due to the heat impacts, but also to the precipitation impacts, as well as due to other variables that are not directly related with climate, that relate the population growth, the increase specifically of the urban population, and therefore the increase of social inequalities within the urban context. In this case, in the left, you can see a plot provided by World Mapper that shows the percentage differentiation between urban residents and rural residents from the 50s until 2050. And it is visible how the percentage of urban population, it is in green, it is increasing over time. And by 2050, the quantity of urban residents will correspond to the 68%, while more or less, and the quantity of rural residents will correspond to the 31%. And this is a percentage that must also take into account, as I was mentioned before, the increase of population by 2050. As you can see in the right sides of the slide, the population increase will be especially focused on the most vulnerable areas of our planet, Asia and Africa. And in that case, the size of the state corresponds to the quantities, the percentage of the increase of that specific state. So in the case of Asia, you can see India as a prominent, and in the case of Africa, you can see Nigeria. While city lives continue to offer many opportunities, including access to better healthcare and technologies, for example, today's urban environment can concentrate health risks and introduce new hazards. This is what Sarah Louise-Barber stated, and she is the head of the Center for Health Development of the World Health Organization. But This is is something that is common, and it is also in the front of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. As you can see here, the IPCC itself, it is stated how hot extremes, including heat wave, have been intensified in cities, as we already know from our perception. And observed impacts are concentrated usually amongst the most disadvantaged groups. Therefore, the marginalized urban residents affected by most disadvantaged economical but also social conditions. And the increase of the magnitude and of the duration of heat in urban areas will also exacerbate existing inequalities. This is vicious cycles provided by Islam et al. And it is about social inequalities and climate change. And as you can see here, the starting point is the occurrence of a specific climate hazard, in this case, for example, heat waves or urban island phenomena related to heat waves. And this climate hazard can bring to indirect losses that can be related to adverse effects on the market or prices effects, or direct losses. And in both cases, these losses are suffered the most by the most disadvantaged groups that are the first subgroups of the population who is in fact more affected by the impacts of climate change. In terms of the epidemiological background, in here you can see a plot provided by a really interesting studies by Gasparini et al. On the Lancet journal. And all the bars correspond to a specific state. And this study was developed to understand how the population within those states, it is affected by the impacts of heat, of extreme temperatures, therefore of heat and cold. In this case, you can see 4 bars for each state: extreme cold and moderate cold in blue and light blue, and moderate heat and extreme heat, respectively, in light red and dark red. The yellow line here, it is over Italy. This because Italy holds the uppermost heat-related effects on daily mortality, considering hot temperatures, moderate heat, but also extreme heat. And these impacts are, of course, projected to increase consistently in the future. This is also the reason why I choose within my research, in this case, my PhD research, as an empirical study, 1 Italian urban areas. This is the main structure of my research. I started all of these steps relate to 4 sustainable development goals, specifically the number 3 about good health and well-being, number 10 related to reducing inequalities, the number 11 related to sustainable communities and cities, and the number 13 that is the one related to climate change. I started with a literature review on the heat nexus in order to understand which are the main drivers of vulnerability for the population at the urban scale. And the last 3 steps relate to empirical studies, where the focus was to understand how the relative risks are divided within singular urban areas, considering the different socioeconomic variables. The first 3 steps are concretely published in articles, while the 4th one is still under analysis, under elaboration, let's say. Starting from the first one, the literature review, the title here is The Heat Nexus in the Urban Context, exploring the socioeconomic vulnerabilities as well as the built environment characteristics. We considered 40 articles in this case, starting with a research algorithm through Scopus and PubMed, and including 2 main criteria. The first one was related to the fact that we just choose empirical studies that was focused on the nexus between heat and health. And the second was focused on the fact that we wanted also the inclusion of built environment characteristics in the analysis. In this case, not empirical, but not only empirical, of course, but also like in a qualitative evaluation. The findings demonstrated a heterogeneous spatial distribution of case studies, and this is also due to the fact that we did not include limitation on of the states on our planet, or of the studies considered studies, and there was a certain spatial diversification of vulnerabilities factors that we found, as well as of built environment characteristics that in this case we called as enhanced exposure variables. In the case of the socioeconomic vulnerabilities, we decided to categorize them in 4 main categories that are mental and physical health, demographic, social status, and economic status. This was a choice also based on the literature state of the art at that time, following also the World Health Organization guidelines. For what it might concern, the built environment characteristic, which can influence on the vulnerability of the population, we divide them in indoor as well as outdoor categories. In the right side of these slides, you can see some example. It's just a little fraction of the table that it is within the article. Just to provide you some example for the social categories, we divide them in education and social status group. And for education, we found studies related to education in general, studies related to the lower level of education of the people, which can influence on, of course, on the heat nexus. So on that, therefore, the fact to have a lower educational level can influence a lot on the outcome of health, that can be mortality or morbidity. Or, for example, for the social status, we found a lot of studies that was considering ethnic minorities. For what it might concern indoor and outdoor, for example, in this case, I highlighted the building standard groups that was in both categories. But for what it might concern the indoor environment, we considered studies, we found actually studies with air conditioning, blinds, fans, or lack of central air conditioning. Or for the outdoor environments, still for the building standard groups, we found variables related to building status, direction of the window fronts, and the sides and shading option for windows, and so on. In all these cases, all the variables that we found was have been found significant in the nexus between the heat events and the health outcome of the population in urban areas. But looking at gender, with regard to the demographic category, about the majority of the analyzed paper, around the 90% of the 40 papers, introduced the concept of age differentiations and gender differences. Women live longer and die older than men, therefore gender and age are interlinked variables. And by looking at gender, most of the case study highlighted that females were found more at risk in respects to males during heat wave events. And this discrepancy can be due to several aspects. Some of them can be related to the response to the thermal stress due to the physiological characteristic of the person in the body temperature regulation, or this other explanation can be related to the fact that the lower social condition that characterize elderly women, which often live alone due to the longer life expectancy compared to men. Therefore, women are mostly characterized by social isolation. And this, under extreme impacts of climate change, can bring to faster health outcomes, negative health outcomes. So the case study that we used within this analysis is the city of Turin. This because the city of Turin owns the longest time series which connect through record linkage processes health outcome together with informational, social and economic information of the individual, as well as the residence of the individual itself. So it is possible also to understand how the distribution of vulnerability is distributed within the cities. And as the climate dataset that we used have been WERRA-MESC and SURFEX, that has a resolution of 5.5 kilometers, and REA-IT dataset, that is dataset now on Copernicus, provided by division, the REMHI division, that is about 2 kilometers, and over Italy is all available. So thanks to this dataset, I developed the first empirical study that is called Social Inequalities in Heat Attributable Mortality Within the City in the northwest of Italy. The aim of the study was to investigate the association between daily temperatures and mortality during the time slot under analysis, that is 37 years time series from 1982 until 2018. That's why it's 18 and not 19 or 20, because at that time was available only that year. And this association was investigated among different social and demographic groups, such as sex, age, educational level, marital status, and household occupants. And as you can see here in the table, it's really little, but maybe it is a bit readable. These categories have been divided between men and women to understand how the relative risks are really high percentile of temperature, that in this case is the 99 percentile, react to really heat stress conditions, let's say. And what we found is that the effect of heat on mortality varied largely by each analyzed category, with higher relative risk for women, the oldest, and among those who lived alone. In fact, as you can see in the left side within the right plot square, sorry, for men we discovered that the relative risks of really high temperature was about 1.56, and that means that under a really hot condition, there is a mortality that can increase by 56%, while for women this rate is much higher, is 1.88. And the same, also because it is related to the relative risks, it is seen for the attributable fraction of death that is much higher for women instead of men. The third study of this research was to investigate how these relative risks subdivided in all these subgroups of the populations, women, men, people from 65 until 84 years, over 85s, until primary school, over primary school, married, unmarried, and widower, and alone and not alone. So people who are living alone in the apartment and people who are sharing the apartment with other people, then this is a proxy for social isolation mainly. We considered these 37 years of time series, and we divided it in intervals in order to understand if over the time there was adaptation or maladaptation. That means that if the relative risk curve it is increasing, this implies maladaptation because temperature are increasing and the relative risk it is increasing. But and this can be seen as obvious, but it is not. In fact, a lot of study carried out by the Institut Global de Salud de Barcelona that provided me the help to develop this methodology within the city of Turin with this data set. They did not find the same. They found that the relative risk of the population of Spain, and especially of Barcelona, it is actually decreasing, also if temperature are increasing. Therefore, the findings here is that the overall increase of relative risks under cold and heat condition suggest a maladaptation to ambient temperature for the population of Turin. Specifically looking at gender, in this case, women have been women are characterized by greater risks under hot conditions, but also under cold conditions. And this may relate to the fact that we just considered population from 65 onwards in this case. Therefore, most of the population over a certain age is composed by women. And because women live longer. And generally, this subgroup of women, it is characterized by lower level of education and higher level of social isolation. And in this case, for the social isolation, it could be a problem because there is not support in the neighborhood around, while for education, it can be a problem since it is not so obvious to how to act in case of extreme temperatures. And this is a map that I found provided by Carbon Brief. The data source is called Global Gender and Climate Alliance and was made in 2016. And what I found here very, very interesting is that this map, it is providing, it is showing how climate change affect women, affect the health of men and women, where on the map you can see the men in violet dots, while women in orange dots. And these impacts are divided between death and injuries from extreme temperatures, such as heat wave, for example. And in these cases, I decided to highlight you here, like the case of Spain, who found this researcher in Valencia found that the exposure to heat wave increased the risks of preterm mortality, but also impacts related to food insecurity, infectious disease, mental illness, and poor reproductive and maternal health. It is really interesting if you have time to look at this map and to click on all of this. And there is an explanation with the related study who supports the theory behind the map. And the last things that I want to mention here is that the gender issue is at the front also in the conference of the parties. In fact, during the intermediate section of that usually are around summer, in this case, June 2022, the UNFCCC, therefore the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who organize the COP every year, publish these synthesis reports of dimension and example of a gender differentiated impacts of climate change, the role of women as an agent of change, and opportunities of women. It's really interesting, and it's quite short because it is because it is an synthesis report. And in this case, I highlighted here some points related to the adaptive capacity of women and men that have been found different, also because women mostly are not cover decision-making processes if we look at the entire world. And most of the reason why there is this discrepancy is also something that we found in our study. This document is open, so everyone can download it. And with this, I finished. Thank you.